The story begins with a perfect family, a seemingly ordinary wife, mother, and husband. But underneath this facade, something fractured, something hidden, something bound to break. In a quiet neighborhood, the life of Octavia Fairweather, a devoted wife and art teacher, unraveled when she stumbled upon the most devastating truth. Her husband, Oscar, had been having an affair with her own mother, Ruth Breedlove. The discovery was an emotional bombshell, shattering the trust and love that had once held this family together. How did it all begin? What drove Oscar to betray his wife with her own mother? And what was Ruth's role in this? As the weeks passed, the cracks deepened. Octavia, consumed by a flood of confusion, anger, and pain, found herself at a breaking point. The secrecy of the affair, the lies, the stolen moments, the deception continued until it couldn't be ignored any longer. The very fabric of their family was on the verge of collapse, but betrayal in this form can only lead to one thing: tragedy. The story took a chilling turn when, after learning the devastating truth, Octavia was pushed beyond the limits of forgiveness. The emotional fallout spiraled into a confrontation that no one could have predicted. Oscar's betrayal was more than just an affair. It became the catalyst for a series of decisions that led to irreversible consequences. What followed was the unraveling of the Fairweather family, a descent into heartbreak, despair, and ultimately, tragedy. In this true crime case, the question looms: what happens when the trust between a wife and her mother is shattered, and the betrayal cuts so deeply? Was it possible to repair what had been broken, or was the fallout inevitable? This documentary will explore every twist and turn in this shocking real-life story, revealing the heartbreak and violence that ensued and the tragic ending that forever changed their lives. What happened to Oscar, Ruth, and Octavia? How could everything go so wrong so fast? This is a tale of betrayal, heartbreak, and the devastating consequences of crossing the line between love and trust. It's a story of a family destroyed, a love triangle that should never have been, and a tragedy that could have been avoided but wasn't. Octavia Fairweather's life was once a picture of peace and harmony, the ideal family portrait. Born into a loving household in the sleepy town of Shady Grove, Octavia was raised with a sense of devotion to her family. Her mother, Ruth Breedlove, was the epitome of elegance and grace, always the center of attention, the woman everyone turned to for advice. Octavia grew up idolizing her mother, a relationship that was characterized by closeness, almost an unspoken understanding. Ruth was not just a mother to her, she was a confidant, a best friend, and the guiding force in her life. The connection between them was so tight-knit that even when Octavia married Oscar Fairweather, it seemed like a natural extension of their family dynamic. Oscar, tall, charming, and seemingly every bit the gentleman, was welcomed into the fold with open arms. Oscar had his own history, a background that was, by all accounts, unremarkable. Raised in a middle-class neighborhood, Oscar had always been the golden boy, excelling in everything he did, from sports to academics. His charm, good looks, and ambition made him the perfect match for Octavia, and their wedding, which took place 5 years after their first meeting, was the talk of Shady Grove. Oscar was an architect, a career that required focus, precision, and creativity. His professional life seemed as flawless as his personal one. To those on the outside, he was the perfect husband, attentive, loving, and dedicated. But the truth, however, would soon prove to be something altogether darker. Before the affair came to light, there were subtle, almost imperceptible red flags, moments when the fairy tale veneer began to crack. It was nothing overt, nothing that would make Octavia immediately suspicious. Instead, it was a series of seemingly insignificant incidents that, in hindsight, painted a much darker picture. For one, Oscar and Ruth's bond was always unusually close. Ruth's fondness for Oscar was often praised, her compliments were often effusive, her attention overly doting. At first, Octavia dismissed it as nothing more than a mother's fondness for her son-in-law, but as the months wore on, she began to notice the lingering glances exchanged between Ruth and Oscar. The flirtation was subtle, disguised under layers of politeness and family dinners, but it was there. It was the way Ruth touched Oscar's arm a little too often, the way she laughed a little too loudly at his jokes. It was the looks they exchanged when Octavia wasn't around, fleeting but meaningful. Meanwhile, Oscar's behavior shifted subtly, but again it didn't raise alarms immediately. He began to spend more and more time at work, often coming home later than usual, his excuse always the same: late-night deadlines, crucial meetings. Octavia believed him, as any loving wife would, but the cracks in his story were starting to show. There were times when Oscar's demeanor seemed distant, distracted. He no longer looked at Octavia the way he once did, and the intimacy they had shared in their early years of marriage began to wane. He would often disappear into his office for hours, or retreat to the basement when they had guests over. The couple's routine changed as well. Weekends, once filled with family outings and intimate moments, became void of energy. Oscar seemed increasingly detached from Octavia, and she grew concerned. At the same time, Ruth had started to visit more often. Ruth was always there, ready to help with anything: cooking, cleaning, or simply keeping Octavia company. But in her presence, there was something unsettling. Ruth's visits felt more like an intrusion than a gesture of kindness. And when Oscar was around, Ruth's attention seemed all-encompassing, her every action directed at him. At one point, Octavia remarked to a close friend that her mother and husband had become inseparable. But that was as far as the suspicion went. She convinced herself that nothing was amiss, that the three of them were simply close. After all, wasn't it normal for a mother to be deeply involved in her daughter's life, even after marriage? Wasn't it just a sign of love and affection? What Octavia didn't know, however, was that behind those seemingly innocent moments, Oscar and Ruth had already crossed a line. Their clandestine affair, which had been brewing for months, was on the verge of being exposed. They thought they had kept it hidden, but all it took was one fateful moment, a forgotten phone, an accidental discovery, and the world as Octavia knew it came crashing down. The affair wasn't just a betrayal, it was a breach of trust so profound that it couldn't be ignored. Octavia found out the truth, not through words, but through a simple text message left on Ruth's phone, one that Oscar had sent late at night. The message was innocent enough on the surface, but Octavia knew something was off. She picked up the phone, her heart pounding, and began to scroll through the messages. The words were casual, but the context was unmistakable. Oscar and Ruth had been in an intimate relationship for months, hiding it from her in plain sight. The shock of the discovery left Octavia numb. How could this happen? How had everything that seemed so perfect been built on lies? The betrayal was almost too much to bear. But it wasn't just Oscar who had shattered her world. It was Ruth, the one person she had trusted above all others. Her mother had not only violated their bond, but had destroyed the very foundation of the family they had built together. In that moment, everything changed. The world around Octavia began to feel surreal, as if she were caught in a nightmare. Her life, her marriage, her relationship with her mother, everything was suddenly called into question. Could she ever trust again? Could she ever look at her mother or her husband the same way? The emotional weight of the betrayal was unbearable, and in the coming weeks, Octavia would be forced to confront the most unimaginable of choices: whether to forgive the unforgivable or to walk away from a life that had once seemed perfect. This story, however, is just the beginning. Because what came next after the affair was exposed would forever alter the lives of everyone involved. What started as a seemingly minor betrayal would cascade into a tragedy that no one saw coming. The affair began innocuously enough, in a way that would be all too easy for any observer to dismiss. Oscar had always been a thoughtful, attentive husband, and Ruth a doting mother. But in hindsight, it was clear that a subtle shift in dynamics had begun long before Octavia ever suspected a thing. It started with the quiet moments. Oscar, who had always been an early riser, began lingering longer in the mornings, skipping out on the usual family breakfast to spend more time at work. Ruth, ever the helpful mother, became a regular presence in their home, spending hours with Octavia, offering unsolicited advice about life, relationships, and even Oscar. In these early months, Oscar had seemed distracted, distant at times, but always with a polite excuse: deadlines, meetings, an overwhelming workload. At the time, Octavia chalked it up to stress, assuming the pressures of his career were weighing on him. But the truth was more complicated, darker than any of them could have imagined. Oscar and Ruth had been slowly drawn to one another. It wasn't just a matter of proximity, though that played a role. No, it was deeper than that. They found in each other something that had been missing from their respective lives. Oscar, whose marriage had become a routine, was drawn to the allure of Ruth's charm, her wisdom, her ease in conversation. Ruth, who had always been a strong, domineering presence in Octavia's life, found herself swept away by the attention of her son-in-law. She had never felt so desired, so appreciated in her life. It started as innocent flirtation, a subtle push of boundaries that neither of them could recognize as the dangerous territory it was. Their affair, however, was no chance encounter. It was meticulously planned, hidden in plain sight. Oscar's late nights, his increasing detachment from Octavia, were all part of the carefully crafted cover story. Ruth's visits, her eagerness to lend a helping hand, were excuses to get closer to Oscar, to forge a connection that no one, not even Octavia, could question. The affair wasn't a passionate explosion of illicit desire. It was a slow, methodical unraveling of the trust that had once defined this family. It was the quiet moments alone in Oscar and Octavia's home, the hushed whispers in the hallway when Octavia was just out of earshot, the lingering touches that seemed so innocent but held so much meaning beneath the surface. As the affair continued, the couple's secrecy deepened. Oscar and Ruth's relationship, though seemingly clandestine, was becoming harder to conceal. The subtle exchanges of affection, the late-night phone calls, the moments when they lingered too long in the same room, it all started to accumulate, weaving a web that would soon become impossible to untangle. Octavia, though she had begun to notice the shift in Oscar's behavior, never imagined the depths of the betrayal. She had always trusted her mother implicitly, relying on Ruth's advice to navigate the challenges of life and marriage. The idea that her mother could be involved with Oscar was beyond her comprehension. Yet, she couldn't shake the unease that had begun to settle in her gut. It was the small things, Oscar's distracted responses, his lack of attention to her needs, his sudden coldness, that she couldn't ignore any longer. But it wasn't until one fateful evening that the truth would be thrust into her face. It all started with a simple oversight: a phone left on the kitchen counter, forgotten in the rush of the evening. Oscar had been particularly aloof that day, retreating into his office after dinner, but Octavia didn't think much of it at the time. It was when she reached for the phone to place it on the charger that she noticed something odd, an unread text message from Ruth. She hesitated for a moment, unsure if it was her place to look, but the quiet curiosity won out. The message was brief, casual, but the tone was unmistakable. "I can't wait to see you again tonight. I miss you." Her heart skipped a beat. At first she thought it was a mistake, a wrong number, perhaps. But then she saw the string of messages beneath it, each one more intimate than the last, each one sealing the truth she had been avoiding. Her hand trembled as she scrolled through the texts, each one a confirmation of her worst fears. Oscar and Ruth had been carrying on a full-blown affair right under her nose, and she had been blind to it. Every glance, every touch, every late night was not just a sign of distance. It was evidence of a betrayal that cut deeper than she could have imagined. The moment that Octavia uncovered the truth, the world around her seemed to collapse in slow motion. The room grew cold, the air thick with disbelief. Her eyes blurred as she read the final message. "I can't wait to be with you. I love you." The words stung like a physical blow, their weight crushing her chest. The love of her life, her husband, had been with her mother, the woman she had trusted more than anyone in the world. The realization was so overwhelming that Octavia felt numb, as though the ground beneath her had been ripped away. Her emotions swung between disbelief, betrayal, and rage. The woman who had raised her, loved her, nurtured her, had been lying to her for months, and the man she had given her heart to, the man who promised to stand by her, had shattered that trust without a second thought. In the hours that followed, Octavia was consumed by a storm of conflicting emotions. Her mind raced as she replayed every moment with Oscar and Ruth, each instance of their closeness now tainted by the knowledge of their secret. It was as though everything had been a lie, their shared moments, their laughter, the love she thought they had. It was all tainted by the affair, by the deception that had run deep, hidden beneath layers of false affection. But Octavia had to know more. She needed to confront them both, to ask the questions that burned in her mind. What had driven them to betray her so completely? Why her mother? Why Oscar? As she sat there, phone in hand, the question that lingered in her mind was not just about their betrayal, it was about whether anything in her life had been real at all. In the midst of the shock, Octavia was forced to make a decision that would define the course of her life. Confront them both, or walk away from it all. The weight of that decision was crushing, the fear of what lay ahead paralyzing. But the truth, as painful as it was now undeniable. The affair had destroyed everything, but Octavia would soon learn that the discovery was only the beginning. What followed would take her down a path she never imagined, as she fought to reclaim her life, her dignity, and the family she had lost. The moment Octavia discovered the truth, the ground beneath her feet seemed to disappear. Her heart raced, her thoughts scattered like dust in the wind. The text messages, the undeniable evidence of betrayal, burned into her mind. But nothing could have prepared her for the moment she would confront the two people who had shattered her world, Oscar and Ruth. Octavia's mind, still reeling from the shock, had only one clear thought. She needed answers. The flood of emotions coursing through her was almost unbearable. Betrayal, humiliation, anger, each emotion fought for dominance, and she found herself trapped in a whirlwind of conflicting impulses. But one thing was clear, she had to confront them, no matter the cost. It was a late evening when Octavia finally decided to face them both. The air in the house felt thick with tension, as though the walls themselves were holding their breath. Oscar was in his office, as he often was, buried in work. Ruth had arrived earlier for what was supposed to be a casual visit, but Octavia could see the shift in her mother's demeanor the moment she walked through the door. Ruth's smile faltered when she saw Octavia's cold expression. The reality of what was coming, of what Octavia had discovered, hung in the air like a storm waiting to break. Octavia wasted no time. "I know," she said, her voice steady but seething with emotion. Her gaze was fixed on Oscar, who immediately stood up from his desk, his face draining of color. Ruth, standing by the kitchen counter, turned slowly, her face unreadable. "You know?" Oscar stammered, his voice shaky. "I know everything," Octavia replied, her words cutting through the air like a blade. "I know about you and her." Her eyes flicked to Ruth, who looked away, unwilling to meet her daughter's gaze. There was a long silence, a painful pause where none of them knew what to say. Oscar, still reeling from the fact that his secret was exposed, attempted to speak, but the words wouldn't come. Ruth, meanwhile, seemed to shrink before Octavia, her proud facade cracking. "You've destroyed everything," Octavia continued, her voice trembling with a mix of anger and sorrow. "My marriage, my family, how could you do this?" Her eyes never left Ruth's face, willing her to offer some explanation, some semblance of remorse. But Ruth remained silent, her gaze lowered, unable or unwilling to meet her daughter's eyes. Oscar finally found his voice, though it was weak, almost apologetic. "Octavia, please." "You're sorry," Octavia interrupted. "Do you even understand what you've done? What you've taken from me? From us? You're nothing but a coward, Oscar." Tears welled in her eyes as she turned to Ruth. "And you, Mom, how could you do this to me? To your daughter? You were supposed to protect me, not destroy me." The pain in her voice was evident, raw and unfiltered. Ruth, unable to meet her daughter's gaze, finally spoke, but her words were hollow, defensive. "I never wanted to hurt you, Octavia," Ruth said softly, her voice strained. "I didn't plan for this to happen. It just happened." The words felt empty, rehearsed, as if she were trying to justify something that was beyond justification. But Octavia could no longer listen. The betrayal, the lies, it was too much. She stormed out of the room, her hands shaking, her heart pounding in her chest. Oscar's attempts to call after her went ignored as she retreated to the solitude of their bedroom, where she collapsed on the bed, her sobs echoing through the walls. The fallout from this revelation was swift and violent, and it wasn't just contained within the walls of their home. The tension between Octavia, Oscar, and Ruth spread like wildfire, igniting a storm of emotions and reactions from everyone around them. Friends who had once been close to the couple began to pull away, unsure of how to react to the scandal that had broken their once perfect family. Some tried to reach out, offering words of comfort and advice, but none of them knew how to truly help. They watched, helpless, as Octavia spiraled into a deep emotional turmoil, unable to come to terms with the magnitude of the betrayal. Some friends, however, couldn't stay silent. One of Octavia's closest friends, Julia, who had known both Oscar and Ruth for years, confronted Oscar directly, demanding to know how he could betray his wife in such a vile way. Julia had been a frequent guest in their home, had shared meals with Oscar and Ruth, And now she was torn between anger and disbelief. "You've hurt her in the worst way possible," Julia told Oscar one evening when he reached out to her, desperate to explain himself. "And what's worse is that you've hurt your own daughter, Ruth. What the hell were you thinking?" Oscar had no answer. He could barely meet Julia's gaze. He had destroyed the most important relationships in his life, and now there seemed to be no way back. The consequences of his actions had alienated him from nearly everyone who once cared about him. Ruth, meanwhile, found herself retreating into herself. Friends who had once called her a confidant now distanced themselves, unsure of how to console the woman who had caused so much pain. Ruth was no longer the graceful, charming woman she had once been. Now, she was a woman who had betrayed her daughter's trust in the most unimaginable way. She had lost her daughter's love, and there was no easy road to reconciliation. But the pain and anger that Octavia felt were far from over. In the days that followed the confrontation, her emotional state only worsened. She couldn't eat, couldn't sleep. Every moment felt like a betrayal, and she found herself grappling with the thought of her entire life being a lie. The life she had built with Oscar, years of shared memories, dreams and love, seemed like nothing but a shattered illusion. Friends and family continued to offer their support, but it was clear that no one knew what to do. Octavia's world had been turned upside down, and she was left to pick up the pieces on her own. There were moments when she considered walking away from everything, leaving Oscar, leaving Ruth, and leaving the life she had known behind. Oscar, meanwhile, was desperate to save his marriage. He begged for forgiveness, pleaded with Octavia to give him a second chance, but how could she trust him again? How could she ever look at him the same way? The guilt he felt was overwhelming, but it was too late. His affair with Ruth had destroyed something that could never be repaired. Ruth, too, attempted to reconcile with Octavia. She sent messages, left voicemails, hoping that somehow through time and explanation she could regain her daughter's trust. But it was all in vain. The hurt was too deep. Octavia's heart, once full of love for both of them, now felt hollow and broken. The threats of violence that Octavia had occasionally entertained in her more desperate moments never materialized, but the desire for retribution was palpable. The thought of confronting Ruth again, of confronting Oscar with the full force of her anger, was tempting, but Octavia knew that violence would never heal the wounds they had caused. Instead, she focused on herself, retreating into solitude, grappling with the emotional aftermath of the affair. For Oscar and Ruth, however, the fallout was not as easily contained. The affair had not only destroyed their relationships with Octavia, but had irrevocably damaged their own lives. For them, the consequences of betrayal were only just beginning. The once perfect family was now in tatters, and the psychological toll of their actions would haunt them for years to come. The aftermath of the revelation sent shockwaves through Octavia's life. What had once been a close-knit family, built on trust and affection, now lay in ruins. The betrayal at the hands of her mother and husband had not only shattered her sense of security, but had also plunged her into an emotional abyss from which it seemed impossible to escape. In the weeks following the confrontation, Octavia's behavior began to change. The confident, independent woman she once was gradually became a shadow of herself. She withdrew from friends, refusing to answer calls or attend social gatherings. Her work, once a source of pride, took a back seat as she spiraled into a deep depression. The overwhelming weight of the betrayal hung over her like a dark cloud, and she found herself paralyzed by anger, grief, and confusion. Those who were close to her started to notice the shift. Julia, her longtime friend, had been one of the few people still trying to support her, but even she found it hard to reach Octavia. She confided in Julia during late-night phone calls, expressing how she couldn't make sense of the situation. "It's like everything I knew was a lie," Octavia would often say, her voice breaking. "I don't know who I am anymore. I don't know what's real." In the days and weeks that followed, Octavia became increasingly isolated. Her once vibrant personality had dulled, replaced by a shell of a woman struggling with her own sense of betrayal. She would sometimes lash out in anger at those closest to her, but it was clear her real fury was reserved for the two people who had caused her so much pain, Oscar and Ruth. Despite their attempts to reach out, Octavia refused to engage. Her messages and phone calls were often met with silence or harsh words. But the anger wasn't only directed outward. Octavia also seemed to turn inward, questioning her own worth. Her self-esteem, once firm and confident, began to crumble. In moments of weakness, she would express thoughts of not being able to live with the betrayal, even hinting at self-harm. Those who loved her feared for her well-being. There were also whispers of threats. Some believed Octavia had even expressed violent thoughts toward her mother and husband. While these claims were never officially documented, those close to her recalled moments of intense rage when Octavia spoke of what she would do to Ruth and Oscar if she ever saw them again. "I don't know what I'd do to her if I had the chance," she would say, her voice trembling with fury. "She destroyed me. She deserves to feel the same pain." These words, while chilling, were often dismissed as mere expressions of grief, as if Octavia was only venting the rage that had consumed her. But in the weeks that followed, the emotional storm brewing inside her would come to a head. The tragedy, when it arrived, was almost inevitable. It occurred one cold winter evening, just over a month after the affair had been uncovered. Oscar had been trying to repair his marriage, making numerous attempts to reconcile with Octavia. He sent flowers, wrote letters, and begged for forgiveness. Ruth, too, had reached out, though her attempts at mending the relationship were less frequent, perhaps because of the immense shame she felt. Still, she had tried to bridge the gap, even suggesting a family meeting where they could all talk things through. Octavia had refused, each attempt only seeming to escalate her resentment. On that night, Oscar, driven by a mix of guilt and desperation, made an unannounced visit to their home, hoping that face-to-face contact would allow him a chance to talk. He had convinced Ruth to join him, believing that together they might be able to salvage what was left of their family. But when they arrived, Octavia was not the woman they had expected to see. In the house, the tension between the three of them was palpable. Oscar tried to speak, to explain himself, but Octavia wasn't interested in hearing anything he had to say. Ruth's presence only seemed to ignite her fury further. The confrontation was brutal. Words were exchanged, some cutting deeper than others. In that heated moment, it was clear that Octavia's emotions were at a boiling point. The anger she had held inside for weeks erupted like a volcano. There were no physical altercations, but the emotional violence was clear. Octavia screamed at her mother, accusing her of destroying her life, calling her names that no daughter should ever direct at her mother. Ruth tried to defend herself, but her voice was drowned out by Octavia's fury. Oscar stood there, frozen, unable to do anything to stop the words or the pain. The argument escalated when Octavia, in a fit of rage, grabbed a nearby object, a small decorative vase, and threw it across the room. It crashed against the wall, sending shards of glass and ceramic flying. Oscar and Ruth recoiled in shock, and it seemed for a moment that Octavia might be on the verge of doing something even more extreme. Octavia's emotional state had reached its breaking point. With her hands shaking, she collapsed onto the couch, her sobs echoing through the room. She couldn't breathe. It felt like her chest was being crushed under the weight of the betrayal, the anger, and the unbearable grief. Oscar, finally able to move, rushed to her side, but she shoved him away. "Leave me alone!" she screamed, her voice raw with emotion. The neighbors, hearing the commotion, called the authorities. The police arrived shortly after, though by the time they got there, the situation had calmed, at least on the surface. There was no physical violence, but the emotional devastation was evident. The officers, assessing the situation, spoke with all parties involved. Though no arrests were made that night, it was clear that Octavia's mental and emotional state was deteriorating. The media, as expected, caught wind of the incident. The tragic nature of the story, a wife betrayed by both her husband and mother, caught the attention of news outlets, and soon the tragedy was splashed across headlines. The words "love triangle" and "family tragedy" filled the airwaves, but what was often lost in the sensationalism was the raw human cost of the betrayal. Octavia's story was not just a scandal, it was a story of deep psychological and emotional trauma, a tragedy of the soul. In the days that followed, the emotional toll on Octavia became clear. She was no longer just a woman betrayed. She was a woman broken, struggling to find her way out of the darkness. She withdrew further into herself, shutting out everyone who tried to reach her. Oscar and Ruth, too, were left to grapple with the consequences of their actions. But for Octavia, the tragedy had taken on an even deeper dimension. The rift between them would never be healed, not by words, not by time. The relationship they had once shared was gone, and all that remained was the painful realization that some wounds could never be undone. As the media circus continued and the public offered their opinions, the true cost of this family's betrayal was still being counted in the quiet moments of pain, isolation, and regret. This was no longer a simple love story gone wrong. It was a story of lives irreparably altered by secrets, lies, and the unbearable weight of betrayal. The tragedy was not just an event, it was a turning point, a moment when everything changed and there was no going back. The emotional fallout of Octavia's discovery was only the beginning. What had been a deeply personal tragedy swiftly transformed into a public spectacle, drawing attention from both the media and law enforcement. The chain of events that led to the tragedy, though emotionally charged, would soon become a legal matter, with the investigation, courtroom drama, and aftermath impacting everyone involved. In the wake of the confrontation, the emotional chaos in the household had calmed, but the undercurrents of grief and anger remained. The authorities were called to the scene by neighbors who had heard shouting and glass breaking during the heated argument. When officers arrived at the scene, the situation was tense, but there was no clear evidence of a crime, no bloodshed, no physical violence, at least not in the moment they intervened. Octavia, however, was clearly emotionally distressed. Though she had calmed somewhat after the eruption, her anguish was evident. The timeline of the investigation began with the initial reports of the confrontation. Officers interviewed Octavia, Oscar, and Ruth, trying to understand the root cause of the disturbance. Oscar and Ruth insisted the argument had been intense but non-violent. However, Octavia's emotional state was clear, and she expressed that the situation had pushed her to a breaking point. She had threatened to make them feel the same way she had been made to feel, but it wasn't immediately clear if this was more than just a figure of speech. In the days following the incident, Octavia was placed under psychiatric evaluation due to her emotional distress, and law enforcement began gathering evidence. During their investigation, the police collected text messages, emails, and recorded phone conversations between Octavia and both Oscar and Ruth. Among the most revealing were a series of messages where Octavia expressed suicidal thoughts, which painted a disturbing picture of her mental state. Though no formal suicide attempt was made, these threats led authorities to take her mental health very seriously. The investigation also delved into the dynamics of the affair. Forensic details from the home, such as the broken vase and traces of alcohol, were recorded, but no physical injuries were found. The lack of clear evidence regarding physical violence did not mean that the authorities weren't treating the case seriously. Instead, the focus shifted to the emotional and psychological abuse that had built up over time, culminating in the breakdown of the family. A key part of the investigation was Octavia's own testimony. While she was initially hesitant to go into detail, the emotional toll of her circumstances eventually led her to speak with detectives about what she had been through. Her statements were pivotal in understanding the events leading to the tragic turn. Court proceedings. The drama unfolds. The legal consequences began to materialize when Octavia's emotional distress, coupled with her threats of violence, led to charges being considered. There were no direct allegations of physical harm or premeditated violence against Ruth and Oscar, but the mental anguish she had experienced was a key component of the investigation. The question of whether Octavia's emotional state was a mitigating factor in what happened was central to the court's consideration. As the case moved through the legal system, the courtroom drama began. Octavia's legal team argued that she had been pushed to the edge, asserting that the betrayal by both Oscar and Ruth had led her to a point where she was unable to make rational decisions. They pointed to her mental health issues and emotional state as an important part of her defense. On the other side, prosecutors maintained that the affair was not an excuse for any threats or actions she may have taken during her emotional collapse. The trial captivated the public's attention, with media outlets covering every detail. The case raised questions about family loyalty, trust, and the emotional toll of betrayal. It also highlighted the complex dynamics of relationships. What happens when those closest to you, the people you love, betray you in the most profound ways? Ultimately, the court ruled that while Octavia's emotional state was a factor, she had not committed a crime that warranted a heavy sentence. Instead, she was placed under psychiatric care and given therapy to address the trauma. Oscar and Ruth faced their own repercussions in the form of societal backlash. Oscar's career, once thriving, suffered. Public opinion was firmly against him, and even Ruth found herself ostracized by many of her peers, unable to regain the trust of those who had once supported her. The impact of the tragedy on the surviving members of the family was profound. For Octavia, the road to recovery was long and fraught with challenges. The months following the trial were difficult as she struggled with the emotional aftermath. Her connection with Oscar and Ruth remained irreparably fractured, and while her mental health slowly improved with therapy, the emotional scars would never fully heal. Octavia's therapy sessions focused on helping her process the feelings of betrayal and loss, but her sense of trust, particularly in the people who had once been closest to her, was shattered beyond repair. Oscar, now facing the fallout of his affair, attempted to pick up the pieces of his life, but the weight of his actions hung over him. The damage to his relationship with Octavia was irreparable, and his attempts at reconciling with her only further fueled her anger and distrust. Oscar's career, once a source of pride, faltered as he faced public backlash for his infidelity. His business suffered, his social life became limited, and the man who once seemed secure in his life now struggled to regain any semblance of normalcy. Ruth, too, was left to deal with the consequences. The betrayal of her daughter had cost her dearly not just the bond with Octavia, but the trust of others in her social circle. Ruth was left alone in the wake of the scandal, grappling with guilt and regret over her actions. The attempt to repair her relationship with Octavia was fruitless, and she came to realize that some wounds were too deep to mend. While none of the family members faced significant criminal charges, the emotional and psychological toll of the betrayal was more than any legal proceeding could address. The once close-knit family was irrevocably changed. They had all suffered, and each would carry the weight of the tragedy for the rest of their lives. In the years that followed, Octavia found a sense of peace, albeit in a different form than she had once imagined. She rebuilt her life, but the relationships she had once cherished were gone. Oscar and Ruth, meanwhile, continued to live with the consequences of their actions, a painful reminder of the irreparable damage betrayal can cause. The investigation and subsequent legal proceedings highlighted not only the emotional damage of infidelity and betrayal, but also the devastating ripple effect it can have on the lives of those involved. The tragedy was more than just a moment, it was the beginning of a lifetime of consequences, forever altering the lives of those who had once been a family. The psychological and social impact of betrayal within familial relationships is profound and far-reaching. When a wife uncovers that her husband has been having an affair not only with another woman, but with her own mother, the emotional toll is often catastrophic. To understand the depths of this betrayal, it's essential to explore the psychological effects of infidelity and deception, particularly in such a deeply connected, intimate relationship like that of a mother, husband, and wife. Betrayal within families cuts deeper than in any other relationship because of the level of trust and dependence that is usually present. Psychologist Dr. Jennifer Freed explains that familial betrayal, especially in a marriage or parent-child relationship, involves a profound sense of broken attachment, which disrupts the very foundation of security and safety that people rely on for emotional stability. This betrayal challenges the sense of identity that is built through long-standing relationships. In the case of Octavia, the betrayal was not just a personal attack from her husband, Oscar, but an assault on her core beliefs about love, loyalty, and trust. When a spouse, someone who has promised to love and protect, betrays that trust, it often leads to a significant identity crisis. Octavia was left grappling with conflicting feelings, anger toward her husband, sorrow toward her mother, and a crushing sense of self-doubt. Dr. Laura Berman, a psychotherapist and author specializing in relationships, notes that betrayal within the family unit can trigger feelings of disenfranchised grief, meaning that the victim's pain is often minimized or ignored by others. In this case, while the public's gaze might have focused on the sensationalism of the affair, Octavia's grief was uniquely her own, and it was compounded by the fact that it came from the people closest to her. This dual betrayal was emotionally destabilizing and often leaves lasting scars that can take years to heal. Infidelity in marriages often leads to feelings of worthlessness, anxiety, and depression as it erodes the victim's sense of self-esteem. Betrayed spouses, particularly those who experience the infidelity of both a partner and a parent, can find themselves in a spiral of emotional pain. Dr. Shirley Glass, an expert on infidelity, explains that the impact of an affair can lead to a breakdown of trust that is nearly impossible to repair. She adds that those who experience infidelity often suffer from intrusive thoughts, repeated involuntary memories of the affair that continuously re-trigger feelings of betrayal. For Octavia, the psychological toll was evident in her emotional withdrawal, self-blame, and depression. While society often expects people to move on from affairs, the emotional damage of betrayal does not disappear. The trauma of discovering that not only was her husband unfaithful, but her mother was complicit in that betrayal is a form of psychological trauma that can disrupt an individual's entire sense of safety and worldview. This often leads to difficulties with attachment, future relationships, and a pervasive distrust in others. This tragic case also highlights broader societal issues surrounding gender, familial expectations, and the emotional weight of secrets. Sociologist Dr. Marsha Garrison discusses how societal structures often idealize family dynamics, promoting an unrealistic notion of loyalty and unconditional love. When these ideals are shattered, particularly through infidelity or betrayal, the individual is left to contend with not only personal loss, but also a sense of public failure. Moreover, this case draws attention to the societal pressures that shape familial expectations. The expectation that a mother-daughter relationship should be one of unconditional support and trust adds a layer of betrayal that is uniquely devastating. The societal narrative often fails to account for the complexities of human relationships, focusing instead on idealized representations of family unity and loyalty. Octavia's story, in this sense, forces a deeper reflection on what happens when those ideals are violated. As we reflect on Octavia's story and the devastation caused by the betrayal she experienced, it's important to consider the emotional and psychological impact of such events. 1. What would you have done if you were in Octavia's shoes? Would you have been able to forgive your husband or mother, or would the damage be too great to repair? 2. How does this case reflect the larger societal pressure to maintain family unity at all costs? Can you relate to the idea of feeling torn between what society expects of family relationships and what feels right emotionally? 3. What steps do you think could have been taken to prevent this tragedy? Is there a way to rebuild trust after such a deep betrayal, or is it truly irreparable? Understanding the emotional weight of betrayal, especially within families, forces us to grapple with difficult questions about loyalty, forgiveness, and the fragility of human relationships. This case, while unique in its details, mirrors many of the complexities and challenges that individuals face when trust is broken. The psychological fallout from betrayal is a devastating reminder of how deeply family members can affect one another, sometimes for better, but just as easily for worse. As we close the chapter on this tragic tale of betrayal, let's take a moment to reflect on the series of events that led to an unimaginable family rupture. The discovery of infidelity, an affair between Octavia's husband, Oscar, and her mother, Ruth, set off a cascade of emotional and psychological consequences that no one could have foreseen. The heartbreaking confrontation, the fallout that shattered a family, and the devastating consequences that followed are not just the result of an affair, but of deeply rooted emotional turmoil, trust broken beyond repair, and the aftermath that impacted everyone involved. Despite the court's ruling and the legal consequences that followed, the unresolved emotional scars remain. The key questions: could this tragedy have been avoided? Is there a way to rebuild trust after such profound betrayal? Linger long after the courtroom drama fades away. The story ends with no easy answers, just the painful reminder that the impact of betrayal in familial relationships extends far beyond the moment of discovery. It shapes the trajectory of lives, and in some cases, it can lead to irreparable harm. This case highlights the far-reaching consequences of deceit and dishonesty, both within families and in broader societal contexts. Betrayal is never a simple act. It's a complex web of emotions, lies, and shattered expectations that leaves deep emotional scars, often affecting generations. But perhaps there is a lesson to be learned from this tragedy. It forces us to ask ourselves, what happens when loyalty and trust are broken in the most intimate of relationships? How do we rebuild and heal from such devastation? And what steps can we take to prevent this from happening in our own lives? Now, we want to hear from you. Do you think justice was truly served in this case? What are your thoughts on this unimaginable family drama and the consequences of betrayal? Share your reflections in the comments below, and let's start a conversation about the true cost of deceit in relationships. If you found this story as compelling and thought-provoking as we have, don't forget to like, subscribe, and share this video to keep up with more stories in our True Crime Scene series. Stay tuned for more complex tales that explore the depths of human emotion and the far-reaching effects of betrayal.